The doctor gave me 6 months to live, and that was 4 months ago, so I have 8 weeks left, maybe less to do. The one thing I promised myself I would do before I die, and that thing is to land my plane inside the Colosseum in Rome, because when I was 7 years old, my father took me to Italy, and we stood in the center of that ancient arena, and he told me stories about gladiators, about men who faced impossible odds with courage and honor. And he said, "Son, someday you will face your own arena, your own battle. And when that day comes, I want you to remember that the bravest men are not the ones who never feel fear. They are the ones who walk into the arena anyway." My name is Marcus Reed. I am 42 years old. I was a fighter pilot for 15 years. I flew missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. I have landed on aircraft carriers in storms, and I have stared death in the face more times than I can count. But nothing prepared me for the words. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer, inoperable, untreatable. And when the oncologist said those words, I did not think about all the things I would miss. I thought about that moment in the Colosseum with my father, who died 10 years ago. And I thought about the promise I made to him that when my time came, I would face it like a gladiator, with courage, with honor, and with one final impossible act that would prove I lived fully until my very last breath. I found out about the cancer on a Tuesday in March. I had been feeling tired for months, losing weight, having stomach pains. But I ignored it because I am a pilot, and pilots do not get sick. We push through. We fly through storms. We land when everyone else turns back. And then one morning I collapsed in my hangar and woke up in a hospital with a doctor looking at me with that expression doctors get when they have to deliver news that will destroy your world. And he said, "Marcus, we found a mass in your pancreas, and it has spread to your liver and lymph nodes. And I am very sorry, but there is nothing we can do except make you comfortable." I asked him how long, and he said 6 months, maybe a year with treatment. But the treatment would make me sick, would steal what little time I had left. And I thought about my father, about how he died of the same cancer 15 years ago, and how I watched him waste away in a hospital bed, hooked to machines, unable to walk, unable to eat, unable to be the strong man I had known all my life. And I decided right then that I would not die that way. I would not spend my final months in a bed waiting for the end. I would spend them flying, planning and preparing for one last mission that would honor my father, honor my life, and prove that even death could not take away my ability to choose how my story ends. My father, Antonio Reed, was an Italian immigrant who came to America with nothing and built a successful construction business. And he never forgot where he came from, never forgot the history and culture of Rome. And every summer he would take me back to Italy, and we would visit ruins and museums, and he would tell me stories about the Roman Empire, about Spartacus and Maximus, about men who chose honor over survival. And when I was 7, we visited the Colosseum, and I remember standing in the center of that arena, looking up at the tiers of stone seats, imagining 50,000 Romans screaming as gladiators fought below. And my father knelt down beside me and said, "Marcus, this is where men became legends, not because they won, but because they faced their fate with courage." He told me that when his time came, he wanted to be like those gladiators, wanted to face death standing up, fighting until his last breath. And he made me promise that I would do the same, that I would not waste my life hiding from challenges, that I would always walk into the arena no matter how scared I was. And I promised him, and I kept that promise. I became a fighter pilot. I flew into combat zones. I risked my life for my country, but now I was facing the ultimate arena, and I needed to honor that promise in a way that would make my father proud, in a way that would prove his son had become the man he raised me to be. The idea came to me 2 days after the diagnosis. I was sitting in my hangar, staring at my plane, a modified Zlin Savage Cub, capable of short takeoff and landing. And I thought about all the impossible places I had dreamed of landing. And suddenly I remembered that moment in the Colosseum with my father. And I thought, what if I could land there? What if I could bring my plane into that arena, just like the gladiators entered 2,000 years ago, and face my death in the same place my father taught me about courage and honor? And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense, because this was not about breaking rules or making headlines. This was about completing a circle, about returning to the place where my journey began, and ending it on my terms. I started researching, immediately studying the Colosseum's dimensions, its structure, its security systems, and I learned that the arena floor is approximately 83 meters long and 48 meters wide. Plenty of space for a STOL aircraft, if I could somehow get permission or find a way to bypass security. And I studied satellite images, aerial photos, tourist videos, anything that could help me understand the approach, angles, the wind patterns, the obstacles, and I realized this was possible technically. It was completely possible, the only questions were legal and moral. But I was dying, so legal consequences did not scare me. And morally, I felt this was the most honest thing I could do. Honor my father, honor the gladiators, honor the idea that life should be lived fully until the very end. I did not tell anyone at first, not my sister, not my friends, not even my oncologist, because I knew they would try to stop me, would say I was being irrational, that the cancer had affected my judgment, but this was not irrational. This was the clearest thought I had ever had, because for the first time in 4 months, I felt alive again, felt like I had purpose and direction, and I threw myself into planning with the same intensity I had brought to military missions, and I calculated fuel requirements, studied Italian aviation law, researched historical precedents of unauthorized landings, and slowly a plan took shape. The timing had to be perfect. I would fly from a small airfield north of Rome at dawn, when security would be lightest, when tourists had not yet arrived, when the city was still waking up, and I would approach from the east, using the rising sun to blind any cameras or observers, and I would come in fast and low, hugging the Tiber River, until the last moment, then pull up and drop into the Colosseum before anyone could react. And I would have maybe 5 minutes before police arrived, 5 minutes, to stand in that arena to feel what the gladiators felt to honor my father, and then I would surrender, because this was not about escape. This was about completion, about finishing what my father started when he brought a 7-year-old boy to Rome and taught him that courage matters more than survival. 3 months into my diagnosis, I was losing weight rapidly. My skin was turning yellow from liver failure, and the pain was constant, but I refused heavy medications because I needed to stay sharp, needed to keep flying, needed to maintain the skills required for what I was planning, and my oncologist begged me to start palliative care, said I was suffering unnecessarily, but I told him suffering is part of the arena. Suffering is what separates those who truly live from those who merely exist. And he looked at me like I was crazy, but he did not understand that I had already made peace with death. The only question now was how I would meet it. I sold everything I owned, my house, my car, my possessions, everything except my plane, and my father's old flight jacket, the one he wore when he flew crop dusters in Italy before immigrating to America, and I used the money to modify the Savage Cub, reinforced the landing gear, installed a more powerful engine, added extra fuel tanks for extended range. And I worked on that plane myself, even as my body weakened, even as simple tasks became exhausting. Because working on the plane kept me connected to the mission, kept me focused on something beyond the cancer, beyond the pain, beyond the fear that sometimes woke me at 3 a.m., wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. I also started studying Italian again, the language my father spoke to me as a child, and I watched documentaries about gladiators, about the Colosseum, about the psychology of men facing death in the arena, and I learned that most gladiators were not criminals or slaves forced to fight. Many were volunteers, men who chose the arena because it offered them something civilian life could not offer: glory, honor, purpose, and a chance to control their own fate even in death. And I understood them completely, because that was exactly what I was doing, choosing my arena, choosing my moment, choosing to die, doing something meaningful rather than wasting away in a hospital bed. The logistics were complicated. I needed to get into Italian airspace without raising alarms, needed to fly low enough to avoid primary radar, needed to time my approach perfectly, and I spent weeks studying flight patterns around Rome, identifying gaps in coverage, learning the schedules of air traffic controllers, and finally I found my window Sunday morning at 6 a.m. when traffic was lightest, when the city was sleeping, when the Colosseum would be empty and unguarded. and that became my target date. June 15th, exactly 4 months after my diagnosis, exactly 2 months before the doctors predicted I would die. I also wrote letters to everyone I loved. My sister, explaining why I had to do this. My former squadron mates thanking them. For the brotherhood we shared, my oncologist apologizing for being a difficult patient. And I wrote a long letter to my father, even though he had been dead for 10 years, because I needed to tell him that I remembered everything he taught me, that I had tried to live with honor and courage, and that my final act would be a tribute to him, to his memory, to the promise we made in that arena 35 years ago. And writing those letters gave me peace, because I realized I was not running from death, I was running toward meaning. The pain got worse as June approached. There were days I could barely get out of bed, days when I vomited everything I ate. Days when I looked in the mirror and did not recognize the hollow-eyed skeleton staring back. But I kept training, kept flying short practice runs, kept my skills sharp, because I would only have one chance at this. And if I failed, if I crashed before reaching the Colosseum, or lost control on approach, I would die, badly, die meaninglessly. And that was unacceptable, because this mission was not just about me. It was about everyone who has ever faced impossible odds, everyone who has ever had to choose between a safe, quiet death and a dangerous, meaningful one. And I wanted my choice to inspire them, to show them that courage is always possible, even at the very end. 2 weeks before the flight, I made a pilgrimage to the cemetery where my father was buried, and I sat by his grave and told him everything about the cancer, about the plan, about why I needed to do this. And I swear I felt his presence, felt his approval, felt like he was saying yes. Marcus, this is how a man dies. This is how my son should face his end. And I left a stone on his headstone, the way Jews do, to show respect, to show I had visited, to show that even in death, our connection remained strong. And as I walked away, I felt lighter, felt like I had been carrying a weight for 10 years, and finally set it down. The night before the flight, I could not sleep. I lay in my small apartment in Rome, listening to the city outside and thinking about everything that had led to this moment, every choice, every mission, every risk. And I thought about the gladiators who must have spent their last nights the same way, wondering if they would survive, wondering if they would be brave enough, wondering if their deaths would have meaning. And I understood that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear, to walk into the arena knowing you might not walk out, but doing it anyway, because some things matter more than survival. At 4 a.m., I got up, showered, dressed in my father's old flight jacket, and drove to the airfield north of Rome where my plane waited. And the sky was still dark, but stars were beginning to fade. And I did my pre-flight check, running my hands over the wings, the control surfaces, the landing gear, and I whispered, thank you to that plane, because it had carried me faithfully and would carry me one last time into the arena of my choosing. And then I climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, started the engine, and the sound was like a heartbeat, like life itself. And I thought, this is it. This is my last flight, my last mission, my final chance to prove I lived fully. And I pushed the throttle forward and lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness. The flight south toward Rome took 30 minutes, and I stayed low, following the Tiber River, using its winding path to mask my approach. And the city was still sleeping, only a few lights visible in windows, only a few cars on streets, and I felt like a ghost flying through a world that did not yet know I was there. And the pain in my abdomen was severe despite the medications I had taken, but I ignored it, focused on flying, on the mission, on the fact that in 10 minutes I would be in the Colosseum, standing where gladiators stood facing my death like they faced theirs. At 5:45 a.m., I could see it rising ahead, the Colosseum, massive and ancient and beautiful in the growing dawn light, and my heart started pounding, not from fear, but from excitement, from joy, because I was actually going to do this, actually going to complete the mission, and honor my father. And I dropped to 50 feet above the river, racing past buildings, past bridges, past early morning joggers who looked up in shock as a small plane roared overhead. And I thought, sorry for the noise, but I have an appointment with history. I pulled up hard at the last second, climbing over the outer walls of the Colosseum, and suddenly I was above the arena looking down into that oval of ancient stone, and it was empty, perfectly empty, just like I had hoped, and I cut power, dropped the nose, and descended into the arena like dropping into a bowl, and the walls rose up around me, blocking out the city, blocking out everything except that sacred space where men had fought and died 2,000 years ago, and I lined up with the long axis of the arena, dropped my landing gear, and felt the wheels touch ancient stone. I rolled to a stop in the center of the arena, and for a moment I just sat there engine idling, and I looked around at the tiers of seats rising up on all sides, and I could almost hear them, the 50,000 Romans screaming and cheering. And I thought, this is what it felt like to be a gladiator, to stand in the center of the world's attention, to face death with an audience. And I understood why they did it, why they chose this, because dying here, dying with purpose and spectacle, was better than dying quietly in the darkness. And I shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit. The silence was profound, just wind and the distant sound of the city waking up. And I stood in the center of the Colosseum arena, on the same ground where gladiators had stood. And I looked up at the sky, turning from dark blue to gold. And I felt my father's presence, felt like he was there with me watching from the stands, and I said out loud, "Dad, I did it. I walked into the arena just like you taught me, and I am not afraid." And my voice echoed off the ancient stones, and I started crying, not from sadness, but from relief, from completion, from knowing that I had lived my life fully, that I had honored my promise that I would die the way I wanted to die. I heard sirens, then police cars arriving, security guards shouting, but I did not move. I just stood there in my father's flight jacket, looking up at the lightening sky, and I thought about all the men who had stood here before me, gladiators who faced lions and other warriors who knew death was likely, but fought anyway. And I felt connected to them across 2,000 years, connected by the simple truth that courage is timeless, that choosing how you face death is the final freedom no one can take from you. And I was grateful for the cancer for forcing me to confront this, grateful for my father for teaching me about honor, grateful for this moment standing in the arena at the end of my life. The police surrounded me, weapons drawn, shouting in Italian, but I raised my hands slowly, calmly, and said in Italian, "I am unarmed. I am dying. I came here to honor my father." And they looked confused, looked at my plane sitting impossibly in the Colosseum. And one of them lowered his weapon and said, "You flew into the Colosseum?" And I nodded and said, "Yes, I am a gladiator, and this is my arena." And he stared at me for a long moment. And then I saw something change in his face, something like understanding, like respect. And he said, "You are very brave or very crazy," and I smiled and said, "Maybe both." They arrested me, of course, took me to a police station, charged me with about 20 different violations. But the story spread instantly. Social media exploded with photos and videos of my plane in the Colosseum, and people around the world started calling me the last gladiator. And journalists wanted interviews, and cancer patients wrote me letters saying I inspired them. And I was overwhelmed, because I had not done this for attention. I had done it for myself, for my father. But I realized that my choice had meaning beyond just me, that by facing death on my terms, I had given other people permission to do the same, to reject the quiet decline, to go out fighting, to choose their arena. The Italian authorities did not know what to do with me. I was clearly dying. The prison doctors confirmed it, and putting a terminal cancer patient in jail seemed cruel. So they released me to a hospice in Rome, and I spent my final weeks there in a room overlooking the city, and people visited me, cancer patients, and pilots, and historians, and philosophers, and we talked about courage, about death, about what it means to live fully. And I realized that landing in the Colosseum had not been the end of my story. It had been the climax. And these final conversations, these moments of connection, were the resolution, the meaning that emerges after the dramatic act. My sister came, and she was angry at first, angry that I had risked everything, angry that I had not said goodbye properly, but then she sat with me and I showed her the letters I had written and the photos from the Colosseum, and I told her about the promise I made to Dad. And she cried and said, "I understand, Marcus, I do not agree, but I understand." And that was enough, because I did not need agreement. I just needed to be understood, to have someone witness my choice and validate that it came from love, not madness. I died 6 weeks after landing in the Colosseum. The cancer finally overwhelmed my body, and I slipped away peacefully in that hospice room overlooking Rome. And my last thought was of my father, of standing with him in the arena when I was 7, and I thought I kept my promise. Dad, I walked into the arena. I faced my death like a gladiator, and I died the way I wanted to die. And I hope you are proud. And I hope when people remember me, they remember not the cancer, but the choice, the decision to take control of my final chapter and write it my way. They scattered my ashes in the Colosseum. The Italian government made an exception, allowed my sister to spread them in the arena where I had landed, and thousands of people attended, strangers who had been inspired by my story, and they called me the modern gladiator, and they said I had shown them that courage still matters, that dying with honor is possible, that even terminal illness cannot steal your dignity if you refuse to surrender it. And my sister told me later that standing in that arena surrounded by people honoring my memory, she finally understood why I did it, because some deaths are just biological facts, but other deaths are statements, declarations of how you choose to exit a stage, and I had chosen to exit like the gladiators, with courage, with spectacle, with meaning. The story did not end with my death. The plane still sits in a museum in Rome. The flight jacket hangs in a display about modern aviation daredevils, and every year on the anniversary of my landing, cancer patients gather at the Colosseum and share their stories, and they call it Gladiator Day, and they talk about fighting their battles with courage and choosing how they face their end. And that legacy, that continuation of the choice I made, that is the real victory. Not that I landed in the Colosseum, but that my landing inspired others to face their own arenas, to walk into the battles life gives them with heads held high and hearts full of courage, because in the end, we all face death. The only question is whether we face it cowering or whether we face it like gladiators. And I chose to be a gladiator, and I hope my choice gives you permission to choose the same.